Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on transport entitled Closing Africa's Transport Infrastructure Deficit, a Regional Perspective. I think all of us would at some point perhaps have been able to listen to President Cyril Ramaphosa give the overview of the infrastructure deficit and the measures that are required to try to close that gap. My name is Godfrey Mutizwa. I'm a journalist. I've covered the unlisted and listed transport sector on the JSE and in South Africa for the past 19 years. And I think it is fair to say government policy in terms of the model for transport in the country has gone the full circle, from full government ownership and funding to public-private partnerships to outright privatization. So I sense this is a significant juncture in terms of that journey. But before we get into the broad vision of how this will work, I wanted to ask all of us, please, to observe a minute of encouragement for Minister Fikile Mbalula in his very difficult challenge of turning R1 billion into 5 billion rand. Minister, thank you for joining us, and we appreciate your time and presence here today.
Thank you very much.
Now, I did hear the president speak of 3 models today in terms of funding, and I just wanted to quickly go over those: commercial funding, blended financing, and fiscal allocation. So I wanted the minister to take us into his confidence about how this will work, in particular in transport. Is this going to be a one-size-fits-all, or are there very specific ways in which this will work for transport?
Thank you very much, program facilitator, and all the panelists, and welcome to this roundtable. I'm not sure, because we're not briefed about the approach. The National Development Plan highlights the need for adequate transport infrastructure in the form of roads and so on. By 2030, investments in transport sector need to respond to eliminating spatial inequalities and facilitate regional and international trade, and promote a low carbon economy by offering transport alternatives. Despite the unfavorable climate brought about by COVID-19, many argue that infrastructure deficit in Africa reduces GDP by improving logistics and trading networks. We can give examples of Mozambique, so on. So its current levels of coal production exceeds its rail capacity, while road network also is largely underdeveloped. According to the World Bank, it takes 12 days to export a container from Egypt. Private sector investment is critical in financing future infrastructure projects. Government cannot do it alone. This is important for many countries, particularly those struggling to fund their own development. However, barriers to private sector investments must be eliminated despite the intractable challenges many African countries face. Number of transport infrastructure projects already in development, from North-South Corridor, the Trans-Sahara gas pipeline to Kinshasa, Brazzaville Bridge Road and rail development, hold key closing Africa's gap. Rail connections across parts of the continent remain poor, and the lessons from advanced economy shows that most of these economies grew on the back of massive investments in port, rail, and infrastructure. And the multiplier arising out of these investments is far-reaching and wide in scope. Investments in transportation network have also enabled the rapid development of the global value chains and become the source of competitiveness for countries. In conclusion, Chair, it is precisely for this reason that 2010 NEPAD heads of state and government orientation agreed to establish the high-level subcommittee on infrastructure in keeping with commitment to accelerate the implementation of program for the infrastructure. And I suppose one referred to a number of projects, and you spoke about funding. I think funding will take a form of both a private and public partnership in terms of realizing the implementation of most of these projects coming to fruition. And here in South Africa, we've got a model, an example of that in terms of rail, rolling stock manufacture, and in terms of its sustainability, it's not solely dependent on government. I think it also requires that partnership with the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for your opening thoughts. I'm going to come back to you because I wanted to remind you that I actually have other people with you today who are going to be part of this conversation. Let me quickly introduce them. We have got Mr. Jack Merwe. He is the head of Gauteng Transport Authority. He is joining us, as you can see, virtually like everybody else as well. With Ms. Portia Darby, CEO of Transnet, Ms. Malebo Matolong, transport expert. Tom Andersen, he's regional head, European Investment Bank, is joining us live from Luxembourg. We also have Monale Ratsoma, Director General, the New Development Bank, the Africa Regional Office. And we also have Ms. Ipeleng, Selele, RRS Trade and Investment Group. She's certainly not the least of our participants today. Everybody, thank you again for your time. Thank you for joining us. Minister, one quick follow-up question on your opening remarks. So we've been reading about the president engaging all the significant funders in terms of infrastructure here in South Africa. And I heard the figure mentioned of 1.5 trillion rand. I wanted to know what is the share of transport of that big chunk of money?
Is that question directed at me? I was disturbed a little bit. Can you come again?
I was just asking about a figure I had in terms of the size of projects that the government looked at in terms of infrastructure. And I had a figure of 1.5 trillion rand. My question was, how much of that figure is for transport? And also, there are a number of projects that have already been approved. I thought maybe this might be the opportunity for you to share with us how many of those projects are in that approved list and which sectors are they?
I can't break it down now in terms of the 1 trillion rand, how much is for transport, but there are a number of projects that cut across rail, maritime, and so on, that will benefit largely from that infrastructure project, as well as aviation in South Africa. So there are big projects that have actually been identified, and the largest of them all, I think it is rail. Not only infrastructure, but also rolling stock. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Minister, for those opening remarks. And since we are talking about rail, let's go to Portia Darby, CEO of Transnet. Portia, thank you. You'd have been listening to the Minister, and you'd also, I imagine, listening to the President when he was talking about the funding models and also, of course, the projects that ought to be done. I wanted to give you an opportunity to give us your opening thoughts in terms of Transnet's place in this discussion and the role that it will play in finding the private money that we all know is required to be added to the government kitty.
Thank you, Godfrey, and good afternoon to the Minister and to the panel. So for me, the conversation is about how do we get reimagining the partnership, right, for infrastructure funding and also for how we bring in the continent. I think it's essential to start off with that we are clear that there may be many projects that need to be undertaken on the continent with regard to that are transport related, both rail, road, ports, as the minister has indicated. One really important first step is to sort out the regulatory model. You would know as well as, and I imagine anyone who's worked looking at projects on the continent, is that for years they've been scoped, railway lines, ports, which have never gotten off the mark. Simply because we've neither been able to get private sector funding, nor have we been able to move towards setting up a regulatory system that enables tariffs to be paid, which would fund both the new investment, but also make the service available. I think this is actually absolutely critical if we're going to be able to make any progress on the continent. If you look at our inter-regional trade, and even for us as Transnet, it's really crucial that we improve our linkages beyond just South Africa into the continent to drive intra-regional trade on the one hand, but also it's to enable the countries in which we pass through to be able to have their own development. So to step back and to get back to our core operations, which is in South Africa, we have an extensive investment program, which is around just improving on our maintenance on our rail system. And as the minister has indicated, and I imagine that Jack would also talk about the rest of the public transport system, I just talk on the freight system, is to increase both the investment on track as well as to increase the investment in rolling stock in South Africa. But a really important priority for us at this stage as Transnet is to deal with the backlog on the rail side, whilst ensuring that we have our ports become very important hubs. Because I think you would have heard, and probably will still hear this afternoon, that one of the big issues that we face as South Africa is not enough port calls by vessels, which then ends up making shipping really expensive for us as South Africa, irrespective of the distance to key trading markets.
Yeah, I want to follow up, Portia, on the issue that you raised about the regional aspect to this issue. In particular, I wanted to talk about the regulatory environment that you said is crucial to fixing before we can even talk about funding models. Is it there? We know, as said, that you guys have been talking a long time about trying to make sure that the region is connected. But we also know now that this conversation needs to take place across the African continent because of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Where are we in terms of that model? And secondly, is there consensus in terms of the funding models that will be required to make those projects that appear to be across our national borders?
Well, I mean, so let's start first. Is it possible to have a regulatory model that would enable the projects to happen? Yes, I think so. However, I think we've all got to rethink, I suppose, what our expectations are. For example, there's a decision to say that all new railway lines on the continent have to be standard gauge. Now, that's nice as a plan and as an idea, but it's quite expensive. And so one of the questions that we must ask ourselves is that where there are existing gauges and there are existing track, should we not be looking at upgrading that for starters? Because to my mind, we've got to get a little bit more commercial about this, because nobody's going to pass us any charity. And we've got to figure out how we increasingly start to pay our way so that we are able to develop the infrastructure. So I honestly, genuinely think that it's possible for us to develop this. If you look at the volume of trade that Africa does with just China, it's phenomenal. And so if you look China and India, there's a hell of a lot of movement that happens between Africa and those regions. So if we were able to better target that, and I think better use the funds that we would be able to get out of that, we would be able to make amazing inroad. I'll just segue. You know the cost of electricity on the continent per kilowatt hour is phenomenal, yet people spend the 20 cents per kilowatt hour plus that they have to spend on electricity. So my point is, if we provide the infrastructure, you would then be able to see a movement in terms of even additional investment. What are the funding? We've all got pension funds, or at least a lot of the countries on the continent have got pension funds. That's long money. We should be looking at how we might use in an intelligent fashion without over-risking pensioners' money to be able to come in as a basis for some of the funding. Sure, I mean, if you're a pensioner, you want to make sure that your money is properly governed. To my mind, I do think that we could, if we have governments that are willing to work together. If I may just end on this point for now, Godfrey, is that a real constraint, and I'm just talking even in terms of our system in South Africa interlinking with Botswana, Zimbabwe, and the rest and the like, we've got to do better around the borders and start creating borderless traffic flows on rail and road, whatever mode we may be using, because unfortunately for us on the continent, we don't have navigable rivers. So we've got to figure out how we make air services more efficient between us and as least cost as we can possibly do, and also ensure that rail is also efficient, as well as ports actually, because you know that the model for vessels, for shipping companies these days, is to look for hub ports, and then you have milk runs that go from smaller to the smaller ports in the region. So could we sit down and figure out where we think as continental Africans, our hubs should locate themselves?
Absolutely, lots to think about for the minister as well, without a shred of doubt. Let's go to Jack. Jack, are the taxis back on the roads?
Can I start off to say, I think we should be funded through blended financing. And to do blended financing, you stand in a long queue. I've learned in my life that you have to be on your knees quite often to ask for money. So if I can go back, the fundamental transport provides for the movement of people, goods, and services, and it's one of the key enablers for sustainable economic growth and development in a country and a region. And I think the president actually emphasized that this morning. In South Africa and in the rest of the world, government funds for transport infrastructure and operations are not sufficient. And the situation has been exacerbated with the COVID-19 crisis. It is essential that other existing and innovative sources of funding for transport must be utilized.
Okay, I think we seem to be having an issue with we seem to be having a problem with Jack's connection. I wonder if there's anything we can do. Let's see if our backup people, if they can look at Jack's connection. We seem to be struggling a little bit to hear him. But I suppose it's absolutely that we hear the voice of Jack in particular in terms of the integrated plan that we have heard is there around Gauteng and the kind of transport issues that we've seen the province having to deal with. So we'll come back to you, Jack, so you give us your overview and also your experience, of course, in running one of the more successful public-private partnerships in terms of the Gautrain. A real joy if you live in Johannesburg. Let's move on to Malebo. Malebo, thank you for joining us this afternoon. You specialize in planning and implementation, and we heard about the need for the policy framework to be right across the region, but we've also heard about the challenges in terms of putting those projects on the ground. Your opening thoughts, if you will, having listened to the minister, having listened to Portia, in terms of what are the key overarching things that the policymakers and the funders and the implementers, for of course the private sector, should be looking at?
Thank you, Godfrey. Thank you, Minister, for the opportunity to engage with you. And also I appreciate the opportunity to collectively participate with the rest of the panelists. Godfrey, for me, there are actually many factors that determine the ability to develop public transport system infrastructure across the continent, with my experience mainly in Kenya, but mainly in South African cities. But for me, none of the factors are as critical as the nature of funding these projects. Funding levels for these projects are generally very high, and they depend on cost effectiveness of the quality of these public transport systems. So it's very important that we start looking at the quality of public transport systems that we want to put in place. But today, I was hoping that I also advocate for how public transport network initiatives ought to be provided for, and merely who should provide for them, because there's also a disjuncture in that area as well. What to provide for Godfrey should be more of a rational choice from a set of potential solutions that are driven by prudent public transport project development and selection that enable better management of public built environment and further make cities more inclusive for all citizens. Today, we saw there was a little bit of touching on the importance of having productive cities, having more inclusive cities, and also responding to environmental impact effects as well. And then just two last points, Godfrey, that I want to touch on is bringing in the concept that we need to also explore a bit further, the choice of the delivery method for public transport networks in general. And for me, this is quite important because if we leverage on a more integrated approach, I'm of the opinion that we will be in a position to leverage private sector funding more, particularly for public transport infrastructure development. Lastly, and to conclude my introduction, the question of who should provide for public transport network also drives the financing process as well. And depending on the delivery method that I was talking to, it's quite important that a pipeline of public transport projects that should ideally emanate from a public transport network implementation plan must ease access to different financing sources and also allow us to gear the different public transport project differently. Experience that shows us that implementing public transport network is a complicated process. We've had almost 10 years or so of planning integrated public transport networks. It requires more than just money to plan, finance, design and build and operate a network. But I think most of the most fundamental as well, that area we need to touch on today, is we must have institutional capacities for all these areas that we want to talk to. And by institutional capacity, it's also a broad topic, but I would want to speak to three important indicators, and those are transport governance capacity, planning capacity, as well as technical capacity.
Okay, we're going to come back and try and see if we can get into some of those. Very quickly, Malebo, I wanted to follow up and ask, you heard the president speak of three funding models, at least I said three: commercial funding, blended financing, and fiscal allocation. And I'm thinking, government is already short of funds. And we know Minister Mbalula in particular has got a problem with funding, as he has been telling the taxi bosses. Isn't fiscal allocation going to delay all of us here? Because we know the private sector money is available, but government money, we know at this particular juncture in COVID-19 is not there.
You are right. You are right, Godfrey, in positioning it in that manner. And particularly in the space that I've been working in, public transport infrastructure development has been mainly fiscally funded. So we need to step out and, in my opinion, structure ourselves quite differently. The issues that I really would want to talk to is this delivery model that we need to have in place, particularly for public transport network. If we are going to be creative in how we want to tap into the private sector market, we really have to clear up a number of things in terms of how we deliver these projects.
Absolutely, 100%. Let's come to Ipeleng. Ipeleng, these are grand projects that we are talking about. They cost a lot of money. And in my coverage of the African continent business environment last year, one of the key criticisms of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area was that you've got these big boys sitting at the top table, talking about these big plans that they are going to have, but unable to carry everybody with them. You talk inclusivity. You talk about the need for us to be more innovative here. Please give us your opening thoughts in terms of, one, what you heard the president say, the minister say, and where you see inclusivity and innovativeness coming into play here to ensure that we're not leaving anybody behind.
Thank you. Thanks, Godfrey. And just a hello to all the panelists. I think, Godfrey, what's critical from what the president said was obviously that there's a need to transform the sector from a skills perspective, from an equity participations perspective, and most importantly, to ensure that we are able to capacitate particularly Black-owned entities. So that was my takeaway from what the president said. And I'm glad that Minister Mbalula also alluded to the maritime sector, because what I'm finding, which is something that truly pains me as the Vice President of Women in the maritime infrastructure continentally, is that maritime transport seems to be missing in action, or either it's lumped under many other forms of transport. And I think it's important that we pay attention to it. And I'll give you just very few examples. I mean, for us, as you know, we are doers on the ground. Now, if you look at the hurdles that we have to face, because I'm listening to everyone alluding to lots of big monies, but I think for me, I listened to also Minister Patricia de Lille talking about going beyond talking, because I just think that we are so overly workshopped and overly seminared and overly conferenced and exhausted.
Webinar.
Exactly. So I think for us, we really want to see acceleration of implementation on the ground, and we really want to see agility, because agility and speed, Godfrey, is quite important for us as private sector. Because remember, for us, if I don't deliver and I don't perform, I don't make money, right? So I think it's important that we go beyond talking, and a sense of urgency. We've got to be able to see that. And to be honest with you, I'm glad we have Portia. We're beginning to see a lot of areas of improvement. We're beginning to see us being able to sit across the table with your Transnet likes to be able to talk about the challenges that we're facing. And one of our key challenges has been a project in Namibia. So we're trying to move manganese and iron ore there from Northern Cape into Walvis Bay, as well as Lüderitz ports. Now you talk about regional integration. Regional integration is simply not going to be successful if, for instance, it takes 12 months for me to be able to get to a point of having a price of how much it's going to cost me to be able to move my cargo. That's number one. If I'm moving chrome or I'm moving copper from Zambia into South Africa, and I must deal with 8 entities where we don't have streamlined commercial systems where I can book my train on the line, I can actually check pricing on the line, and I'm able to track where my train is. We must pack and go home. So I think what's critical here is really to pay attention to innovation and incorporate it, or rather make sure that it's mainstreamed, and also look at single digital platforms that can enable us to unlock this regional trade that we're talking about. So if I have to move my copper, chrome, and I have to go through Zambia Railway Limited, I have to go through NRZ, I have to go through Bay Bridge, Bulawayo, I have to get to South Africa to deal with Transnet Freight Rail, I must deal with TPT for stockpiling my commodities, I must still deal with a shipping line that must take my cargo into the shipping line to get to the end user. You can just imagine what we have to go through. So I just think for me, it's critical that we look at key fundamental call to action imperatives that are going to enable us to unlock what we're talking about. And I think it's going to be very critical that we remain as practical as possible, because again, as I said, really to move beyond talking, and we really need to also be realistic about whether we have the right mindset around the table to be able to tackle this important agenda that we're talking about. So I just think it is critical that the right mindset then shows in action how much I honor the importance of how I treat my fellow Africans. So if I'm dealing with Angola, Botswana, Namibia, how am I dealing with them? Right? So those are key critical issues which I think would have to really look at it. Then from a maritime perspective, if maritime truly carries more than 90% of our trade globally and continentally, what are we doing about it? Because if you look at South Africa, inland waterways, it's almost non-existent. So why can't I at least charter a vessel to be able to move cargo from Durban to Cape Town to unlock the congestion that Durban is faced with? If you go to Durban, there's a road there that's called I think there's the Wharf Road. So if you go to that road and you have so many trucks that are just lining up there, a lot of congestion. How do we deal with unlocking that congestion? Then we're talking trade, because then, as Jack said, it's about movement of goods and people. So for me, I would like us to really focus on the practical terms of enabling this integration. Money will follow a good plan, a good implementation plan. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks, Ipeleng. Thanks, Ipeleng. I see Jack is back with us, and I'm hoping that his connection is better this time. Jack, I'm so sorry we interrupted you there without hearing your full contribution. Please, come in.
Is this better now?
I am hoping so. Slight delay, but I heard you clear.
Right. Just to come back again, for us to attract local and international investors, the key is to select transport infrastructure projects that address the two fundamental challenges facing transport in the world. The one is globalization, where we expect 60% of the world's population will be living in urban areas by 2025, and this number will just increase. And secondly, global warming, greenhouse gases, and pollution. So to address this question of polluting the system, of transport becoming the 18% contributor to pollution, governments have made 3 policy shifts. The first shift is to move as much as possible motorized transport to non-motorized transport. The second shift is to move as much as possible people from private car use to public vehicles. And the third shift is to move as much as possible freight and passengers from road to rail. So these 3 shifts are actually what is driving the whole issue. Now, from infrastructure that we select have to address these 3 big issues. Now, one of these ways, and again looking at blended funding, is to use the public-private partnership method in transport. And I think a lot of people don't realize the first benefit that you get from a PPP is that you secure world's best practices. You get the best plans and designs, so the best practice in designs, construction methods, management, and maintenance. Secondly, you commit the concessionaire to the full life cycle of the project, so they are there for the long run, and they then give you a financial model that gives you a budgetable amount that you know how to budget for through the life of the project. It provides government with off-budget funding. It enforces the user pay principle. And remember, the user pay principle is fundamental for blended funding, and it ensures skills transfer and other socioeconomic requirements. Now, the challenges facing PPPs, and a lot of the panelists have spoken about it, the first is funding. Government must show its portion of this money, and the private sector must show an appetite to invest in these projects. And what would affect the appetite? And the question that we spoke about this morning, about corruption, about the whole environment in which it's operating. The governance structure, in South Africa, we have the PPP framework, which is Schedule 16 of the PFMA. So that has been quite well defined. But then again, the regulatory and the policy framework. We have, for example, not an official rail policy in our country. We have a draft white paper. And if you want people to invest long-term in these projects, especially people from Europe and overseas, that you have to give them the surety of what is happening. And then lastly, the capacity of the state. The capacity of the state to run these really complex and projects. If the president says there's 1.5 trillion rand, you would need quite a capacitated team to run it. And then just finally, that the GMA The Gauteng Management Agency, they've undertaken a study together with the DBSA, National Treasury, and Pegasus on alternative funding sources for transport. So there is a lot of innovation around, and we can talk about that a little bit later. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jack. Are there lessons from the Gauteng that we can take on board here? I'm imagine in your new role, not so new role, in your role as GMA, I am sure you will be taking some of these lessons, do's and not do's, when you look at the greater plan to try to fix the transport problems that we have in Gauteng. Very quickly, Jack.
Yes. I think the thing is that you have to be very clear when you design the contract documents. The drive that we have in South Africa for empowerment, for skills development, all of that, we built it into the Gauteng contract documents in the beginning. So the concessionaire came in, they were very scared of it when they started off, but it's worked very well. And that model we've actually exported to the rest of the world. The World Bank has asked us to go and talk at various countries about how you can do that. So I think it's a piggyback on knowledge that you have, what you've learned in the past. Don't reinvent the wheel when you go to the next project.
Absolutely. And I left our two funders for last because I wanted them to listen to what the government is doing and the articulation that we have had from the president, from the minister, from Jack, as well as from Portia as well, so that they can give us their perspective in terms of the, how should I put it, in terms of the readiness of the things that Jack was talking about, the governance structures, the regulatory framework, the policy frameworks. Are those things there or are they missing, and what needs to be put to ensure that those things are there? Can I begin first with Monale and then we end with Tom?
No, thank you very much, Godfrey, and good afternoon to the Minister and my fellow panelists. I think, a few panelists, and even also in the session in the morning, there was some conversations about regulations. If you can imagine the complexities of putting together regulation that supports infrastructure for regional integration, cross-border, the extent to which we have also, as a bank, as an NDB, had the experience, because there's one project in our book that has been, or we've been trying to implement over 2 years now. The complexities thereof are making it very, very difficult as a project to become viable. But if you take that from a regional point of view and bring it home, there's also a number of challenges. I think what has come through since the morning is that there's a healthy pipeline of projects that is struggling for implementations for reasons that are really about ourselves as a country, that the fact that we keep on tripping ourselves. If we were to take the approach of the BUILD program leading up to the Soccer World Cup, it was clear what the country was focused on. It was clear what the end goal was going to be, and excuse the pun. Everything went according to plan. We should have learned a lot of lessons out of that implementation model. Fast forward, since then, the World Cup, our gross fixed capital formation has been falling steadily, and we find ourselves to date. Many will tell you that issues in infrastructure about project preparedness. Some may even want to test and say they are about financing. I can tell you that through the work that we have done as a bank, as new as we are in South Africa, what has been exposed to a large degree are that those, yes, are problems, but they are bigger underlying issues with the implementation of project. Much of it lending from either regulations or also just policy indecisions. And as we see it, Sandra would tell you that as of today or tomorrow, they could implement a number of projects on roads, but we know very well that they are constrained by the fact that we still have some pending policy issues on GFIP. So that in itself, it's a cost to the economy. The multiplier effect that it would generate by making a decision that we're going to finance GFIP just gives some certainty. And tomorrow, as a bank, we've already, in fact, approved a facility for Sandra to deploy on some of their projects. But we have not been able to roll out. So many of these issues are really very much about how, as South Africa, we are tripping ourselves and holding ourselves back on projects that will enable productivity for the economy to obviously to get on. What I also want to introduce here as a multilateral development bank is the implementation model that has to change. There was a mention also this morning that the state capacity to implement, the capacity has been eroded over time. Cyclically, it means that then your partners have to shift. I'm introducing partners because if I am a commercial bank and you're looking for funds from me, I will give you the resources, and I would look the other way. 5 years later, if my tenure was 5 years or 10 years later, then I will be coming back such that we close the loan and I want my balance. The extent to which those types of funding models are able to give you support and handhold is very limited. So in an environment where you need capacity, it goes without saying that multilateral development banks must be your natural partner for what they bring. When the fiscal is under strain, MDBs will give you the concessional financing, and they will also bring to the table capacity support. Then you need a system that will be designed to be able to deal with the institution type that is MDBs. Municipalities, for instance, would get infrastructure grants from the fiscus because they don't have capacity. At the end of the year, funds will be returned to the fiscus. MDBs are not built to be able to interface with how municipalities will operate, having to issue tender processes and lengthy processes that, in fact, what we need is to be able to get into a municipality and say, you need capacity, we can bring in technical aspect to support the infrastructure. So it means then that the policy needs to be able to shift as the market shifts. And much of it really is very much about political decision making. I think it revolves around the state having to adapt itself as constraints are imposed by the environment, Godfrey.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Tom, if I can come in and before we ask the minister to respond to some of your guys' observations, I just wanted to ask if when you look at the South African situation and the African situation in general in terms of funding infrastructure, do you champ at the bit and say, hey, there's a big opportunity here, I ought to be doing something? Or do you say, hey, there are too many problems here, and where do I begin? I mean, this is going to take a bit of time. Let's see how far we can go before we commit real funds here.
Thank you very much. Dear Minister, honorable facilitator, fellow panelists, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. And actually, I want to congratulate the President on this initiative and thank him first for inviting also the EIB to take part of this process. I mean, we recognize the regional and global importance of South Africa. I think that I just would like to make that point first and stand ready to assist. In fact, we have recently reached out also to National Treasury to go over and above our normal mandate in South Africa under what we call the Team Europe program or initiative due to these unprecedented COVID-19 times. And you'll also be aware that the EU is a very large supporter of the SADC regional integration process, the largest. So we have a history, of course, in the EU to integrate, and we've done that relatively successfully. We argue it's not perfect, nothing is, but nonetheless. I mean, and for us, as the world's largest infrastructure bank, a supporting bank, let's put it that way, a well-functioning, efficient social infrastructure such as transport is acknowledged, as a growth enabler, a catalyst for sustainable, inclusive growth, economic development, job creation, facilitating regional integration, trade, essential economies of scale for all the investing parties. But of course, it has to be the right infrastructure at the right time. And I'm coming back to something also my colleague mentioned before, and it has been mentioned before, of course, that infrastructure, it's been mentioned like almost a magic thing. You invest and then you get reap all the benefits. That's of course not how it works, and we all know when you hear it like that, it doesn't make any sense. So, I mean, let me as a European Investment Bank's regional representative try to give us a little bit more of a regional perspective on the discussion. So as I mentioned, it has to be the right infrastructure at the right time. And of course, a sustainable transport infrastructure project should not be developed in a vacuum. You need a holistic strategy for infrastructure development, considering everything from transport corridors, interlinkages with other sectors, We need energy supply, the water, everything has to be interlinked here. This is essential to ensure that the project corresponds to an optimal resource allocation, as we economists say. I mean, you do not want to find out later that you funded a white elephant, right? I thought that was appropriate here in this context, right? A white elephant. That shouldn't exist, but they do exist in Europe as well. In fact, we've seen them. It sounds a bit strange, but a project that doesn't work, you understand. So, and it shouldn't be there. Such a holistic analysis will also make it easier to get investors and financiers on board, in fact, because they know that all the risks have been more or less covered. And on that basis, the EIB, traditionally an infrastructure bank, to put it in context, we supporting infrastructure around 44 billion euros a year. Now, and then coming back to what Jack said before, experience is of course important. It's critical because you do learn. We all learn. We made our mistakes. But of course, when you fund around 17 billion euros a year globally, so everywhere, including Africa, and you learn certain lessons. And we should also say that our projects are always, the ones we fund are always collaborative in the sense that the EIB funds maximum 50% of cost. So we always bring in private sector investors, or you could be local authorities in principle, and it certainly is other multinational development banks as well. So during the last 10 years, we have financed around 100 billion rands in the transport sector in Africa. And due to this track record and the insights gathered into leading edge technologies, as well as applied innovation across sectors, the participation of MDBs such as EIB provide, a stamp of quality, which was mentioned before, also by Jack, and investor comfort, in fact, very often. They feel comfortable that we've been looking at this and we've done it before. This is not the first time we're doing this, right? That's of course critical, and that also enables this concessional funding. And let me just quickly say that in Africa, we operate under, the EU has certain priorities, and we focus on connectivity because we realize how critical it is to have regional integration. Because as a private investor, what is it you need? You need scale. If you don't have scale, you don't get often the leading edge companies, we have to say. I mean, often it's the large multinationals that have the funds to do research and development. We all know, right? You need some of them also to come to South Africa, and they're there, but we need more, right? And also to be interested in financing and having a nice infrastructure system to support them. We also focus on road safety and aviation, by the way. But and I shouldn't forget climate action, which is very critical for us now. We were designated in November last year as the EU's climate bank. So this is a very critical thing for us now to, let's say, look for projects which are both good for the economy, but also for the environment. And it's possible. We believe it's possible. I have to say we are working hard on it. It's not so easy because we need to get to 50% of our lending, which is these days 63 billion euros a year. Half of that has to be climate in 2025. And we also have to go out of fossil fuels, as an example, by end of 21, or end of 20, actually, end of this year. So, and these kind of things all linked up, as I mentioned, a holistic approach, because you don't want to fund something, an infrastructure project which supports industries which won't be here in 10 years. You don't want that. And that is now to come back to some of the more technical gist of this. And infrastructure is not just an infrastructure, right? That goes for also the large range of projects we are funding right now. We have 10 billion rands of projects under implementation in the SADC region. And that is everything from airports to railways to multimodal facilities, triports, and to strategic regional corridor. And I think these things are extremely important. And what we look at is how do we integrate the whole transport value chain? And how do we ensure social cohesion when we do new projects? And what's the impact on job creation? And all the things have been assessed for these projects, which we have now approved and which we are implementing, which means they're in line with the national development plans of the projects where they are being implemented, the African Union Agenda 2063, and the Sustainable Development Goals. And so basically what it means is, coming back to the points made by my fellow panelists before, it means that they've all undergone financial, technical, environmental, and socioeconomic testing by our in-house sector experts. And that, of course, gives a lot of comfort for investors to come along with us. And of course, we also bring concessional financing, but I think this is a very important point. But our particular challenge now, and I think that's also the challenge of South Africa and frankly around the world, we now have to look at how we reduce congestion, environmental pollution when we do projects as well. We can't just do it because it sounds good. We have to look at all this. So that is what Jack mentioned before. We have to promote the modal shift from private cars to more sustainable transport, including improved intermodal connections. And this will improve air quality, reduce noise pollution, and so on and so forth. These things are extremely important. And I think we stand ready to do that, like with our colleagues, also from NDP and other MDPs, by providing our technical, let's say, and financial structuring capabilities, and also to ensure that the high quality of the projects, and of course with the funding, the competitive funding. That doesn't mean there's enough money coming out of that. It doesn't, because as also mentioned, we are only funding a few projects, which stands as maybe just demonstration projects. So we need to bring in the private sector, governments, and there we need to look at the blending you mentioned before, Godfrey. So where we do that already. Sometimes we go in and finance with a government. So we finance a government. Of course, if the government has skin in the game, that also gives comfort. To just say private sector do it can be a bad sign, right? If you know what I mean. So one has to really look at which projects are profitable. And there you need to let private sector do it. Of course, you need advice and structure. We can help out, NDP can help out. We can all be there, but we also need to look at the projects which are not really, let's say, profitable. And there you need the government to come in with grants, potentially other financiers, and very concessional funding to make them sustainable in the future.
100%. Excellent, Tom. Let's very quickly before the minister's response. Let's listen to Monale. Monale, what do you want to add?
The point I wanted to add is that the SIDSSA process. I mean, we as the bank have been involved since the meeting on the 18th of February with the president, and it was, I think, our understanding was very, very simple, straightforward. That there is no more time for planning. I think we've got the NDP. I think it is a very good guideline of where we need to be going. We have spoken at length about the SIDSSA process and all of those understandings that there are projects, and I think those projects really need to be unlocked. And in an environment where the fiscus is constrained, there are a number of ways through which I think government has to prioritize what this role is going to be, i.e., being able to measure quite clearly what are the different multipliers across different project types. If road offers the highest multiplier for growth and employment creation, then there must be a lot of emphasis. And then you also would then ask, and what will then the role of the fiscus be? Yes, we talk about the fiscus being constrained, but there are a number of tools that are also fiscal in nature, i.e., how do you use guarantees? And the guarantees don't bring about an immediate obligation for government. If you use them productively, such that they are deployed for infrastructure that is going to enhance productive capacity in itself. At first time, it creates aggregate demand, and secondly, it improves the productive capacity of the economy. That is the process through which then you generate enough growth and revenue potential to be able to repay the debt that the economy would have incurred or government would have incurred. So it requires that type of proper measurement of where the multiplier values are, and be able to jealously make decisions that can enable the infrastructure to take place.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for that contribution. I wanted to remind to our listeners that, of course, streaming this live, and we're taking in your comments and questions as well. So you can send in those, and we will read them, and we will also put them to the panelists so that they're able to respond. Minister, you have had a lot to think about, a lot to consider in terms of the submissions that we've had from our panelists. Your responses to some of the issues that have been raised. And I'm going to come back to all our panelists as well, so that they can respond to some of the issues that have been raised and add any comments that they may want. Minister?
Thank you very much. I'm not an answer to everything that has been raised, and I think this panel is an eye-opener for me, and also quite assisting in terms of educating us about what we need to do to accelerate infrastructure in South Africa. At the present moment, we are at an advanced stage of finalizing the national rail policy, which aims, among others, to unshackle the rail sector from the constraints of its heritage and allow it to develop on the strength of challenges that address better the modes of transport we're talking about. Private sector participation in infrastructure and rolling stock is important to solve the impasse from massive investment backlogs and also funding. And that is why we need to understand that this national rail integrated economic regulator is very important for us. Our national policy also recognizes that South Africa's economy is intrinsically linked with other regional economies and prioritizes regional and coastal shipping as an important enabler in unlocking the potential of the oceans. And hence the question of regional integration time as a catalyst for economic renewal and growth. Hence in South Africa, we are talking about corporatization of TNPA, precisely because we need to get more money to be allocated to the expansion of our harbors, to be in a position to be on the competitive edge with the rest of the African continent and the world. And when it comes to the question of funding, it is important to successfully fund, and government must take responsibility for the funding of the infrastructure development projects. Investors need to identify, understand, and overcome challenges. Concession funding is very important. That is why we have gone, about over the years in South Africa. If you talk about our very, very, not so famous and popular experience of the e-tolls in South Africa, we have also realized that through concession funding and many, many other projects. And now we've been really affected because we've got no capacity to borrow more. We've been downgraded over the years in terms of a number of our own modes of infrastructure that we should be raising funds and be funded because of our policy position. So it is going to be important for us to relook into that and continue to replenish as we go forward. And to successfully fund infrastructure development projects, it is important that investors need to identify, understand, and overcome challenges. And to counter some of these challenges, we're in the process of establishing, among others, a maritime development fund as a mechanism to fund maritime infrastructure that will boost Operation Phakisa in the ocean economy projects, amongst others, and which is very much important for us. And earlier on, you asked about the question of which I went back to check with my support staff here about how many projects we will be having as the Department of Transport. This account to about 63 projects, which were actually identified for all sectors of transport as we speak. And I think in conclusion, we need to find the balance in growing our economy through investments in transport infrastructure and also in a manner that grows the regional economies. We can't be isolated. We must ask the hard questions and resolve the intractable challenges that constrain private sector investment in private transport infrastructure. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you for your contribution. As I said, we are streaming this live and we're taking in some of your points and questions as well. So we've got a comment here from Yolisa Kani. She says, or he says, Ipeleng is highlighting the importance of leveraging on technology for regional integration. I totally agree. Keep sending those comments, questions. Let me come to my panelists and ask for your thoughts on the conversation so far in terms of the points that have been raised by your colleagues. Can I start with you, Jack, given we gave you limited time the first time round?
Thank you, Godfrey. I think the lesson that I've learned from today's discussion is that the infrastructure we're talking about is not just the engineering project. I think we fail if we think that this is just something that the engineers will design and build. So you have to look at the whole project pipeline from identifying right through to the next thing is you have to create the enabling environment. Enabling environment, a lot of speakers have spoken about the regulatory framework, the governance framework, and really the image of South Africa in the international market. The third thing I think, which is the biggest crisis, is the capacity of the state. We must have a knowledgeable client. I mean, any consultant can tell you what he wants to. If you don't have a knowledgeable client, you're dead. And where do we create that knowledge? And again, please, it's not just engineering knowledge. We need financial knowledge, legal knowledge, environmental knowledge. If we don't have that, and you know, we have a choice. Do we create it centrally in this infrastructure and investment office, in the office of the presidency, under Switler, or do we create it in state-owned entities, or do we create it within the department? Yes. So I think that is the challenge.
Indeed, and I think to be fair, the president alludes to this because I'm quoting directly here from his statement that he delivered in the morning. Quote, working with the private sector, we will invest in the creation of both the technical and financial engineering capacity in the state. So there's recognition there that there's a deficit and something is going to be done about it. I wanted to go to our ladies. I know you've got your comments, but I wanted to throw this one into the works. So the president also went on and said, quote, the creation of a consistent and predictable project assessment methodology across all of government and the establishment of a single window of entry for project preparation and packaging is key to our success. Is that a game changer in terms of you guys who in particular work with the state from outside? Obviously, Portia would have a different perspective. Can I start with who? Shall we go to Ipeleng or do we go to Malebo?
I can go in, Godfrey. I think I also caught Minister Dilil and Dr. Ramokopa's opening remark, particularly on the importance of how these projects will be evaluated and put on the national-wide project pipeline. For me, what it really means for the Ministry of Transport in particular is that we need to start taking a holistic and a whole of government approach. Themselves, province, local government, including the different agencies that support the Department of Transport, to plan infrastructure and to feed back these lessons that we learn into policy-making processes, so that we also bolster the investment enabling environment that we are talking about today, and providing institutional support to projects when appropriate. Fostering the development of a diverse set of bankable public transport projects for me is also quite important. And as a sector, we need to start also looking at promoting the relevant business models suitable for private sector needs. I think we are not as yet sharp, particularly in the public transport system space, and setting strong eligibility criteria to determine which projects should be built and supported and which should not be. So for me, I think if I could elevate those two in response to the question you posted to us, and for the minister to also consider, it would be great. Thank you.
Absolutely. Ipeleng, you want to come in?
Thanks, Godfrey. I think from my side, really, we are beginning to see progress in a lot of what we're discussing. And I think for me, as a very practical technocrat, I'd like to also say collaboration is quite important, because gone are those days where any institution can think that they can solve a problem in isolation or on their own. And a very good example, I'd like to commend Dr. Ramukhupa for ensuring that in the panels, they've included private sector, such as ourselves, to be able to form part of the conversations, because you also can't have conversations where it's probably predominantly government-owned entities that are talking about with private sector, but not have private sector mainstreamed in that conversation. So I think we also need to look at those measurements, that we actually tick that box. And I think the other critical thing over and above collaboration is the importance of leadership. And I'll point this to probably Minister Mbalula, to say we are very grateful to at least have leadership that is very approachable. And as you can hear, that they're already starting to act on certain things around maritime. I mean, he's just alluded to Maritime Development Fund. So it's good news for us as the industry, and very good news for women in maritime in particular, because what we're trying to do, and we know that the minister supports women-owned companies. So we're quite excited about seeing pockets of excellence, and we're also willing to come to the table to be able to collaborate with the public sector to do our part. And I think what's also critical, looking at coastal shipping, because I alluded to coastal shipping earlier on, it is that we've got a comprehensive maritime transport policy, which outlines our cabotage policy. And cabotage policy simply means that for us to be able to stimulate economy in South Africa, we've got to be able to allow Black-owned companies to move cargo. And a simple example, really, it is to look at, for instance, exporting using CIF, and also importing through FOB, because if I'm exporting CIF as a shipping owner and a vessel chartering company like I am, it means I'm able to then sell and take the goods and deliver them using my own vessels. And probably what I'm alluding to Godfrey, is pleading to the minister to say we might have to look into introducing incentives towards mining companies, because in shipping, cargo is everything. So I can't do shipping without cargo. So if at least minister could start thinking about what incentives can we introduce towards mining companies. If, for instance, they say to Kumba or Anglo-American, can they probably be incentivized to use local-owned or locally owned shipping companies to move cargo, CIF, not FOB like we've been, because predominantly we've been saying we need the appetite to be there and the capability. And we are saying we're here. We have qualified shipping lawyers in our entity. We have qualified shipping traders in our entity. We have rail engineers. We have chemical engineers. So everything the President alluded to, we've got it. So I think what's critical now really is.
Oh, have we lost it? Oh, since they're frozen, Part of the infrastructure that needs to be built to ensure that it is reliable. Ipeleng, I'm hoping that you can hear me. We'll try and see if we can finish your thought. Portia, you want to come in?
Yes, Godfrey. So, I mean, there are quite a lot of issues that have been raised, and
I know.
So let me echo, first of all, some of the things that Ipeleng said earlier on. There's no doubt that a greater efficiency in connections and interconnect and just moving faster is crucial for us to be able to get the benefits, not only of private investors, but also, frankly, some of these things are time. They are opportunity in time that you need to take advantage of. So let's take a simple COVID one, which maybe most people have not been paying attention to. Brazil is out at this stage because of infections, which means that iron ore from South Africa suddenly become very valuable. But in the process, you also have to make sure that you're not only benefiting the majors, you also have to find a way to balance out that you are also making sure that junior coal miners are also able to benefit from that opportunity. The other point that Ipeleng makes, and I'll take it to this point about middlemen. Middlemen in economics make sense where you need them, but there are sometimes, I think, in the South African economy where we've not been able to use enough of our own entrepreneurs to take advantage of the whole value chain, because we too quickly shift the benefit from South African entities or even African companies, and we externalize all of those earnings. And the minute you use middlemen, either traders or whatever it might be, you then are externalizing value that could locate itself in South Africa. I then also want to go to this point. There is no running away from the fact that the moment we get more vessel calls in South Africa, on the continent anywhere, is when we will start to see the cost of shipping going down. But to get increased vessel calls, you need to have a vibrant economy. There's no running away from this. If you look at it, 29% of China's economy GDP is made up of manufacturing. 11.7% is South Africa, and that's one of the highest on the continent, if not the highest. Maybe Egypt is higher than us.
It is the highest.
So,
no, it's higher.
Yeah, so once you are sitting and you're looking at something like that, you just know we have far and long to go, and we've got to work in a concerted effort to arrive at this. That's my one point. The other point is, you know, I think the presumption always is that Transnet controls virtually every single terminal in South Africa. It's not true. There are 98 terminals in South Africa. Only 21 are controlled by Transnet. Sure, there are opportunities for the private sector to start working with us around the containers to some extent. And actually, frankly, there's also opportunities to develop additional container terminals. But the development of the additional container terminals does not take away from this need to ensure that we have hub ports that are able to bring in the super post-Panamax vessels into South Africa. So that's the one. The other issue, which I think we tend, I don't understand how we forget it. If you look at Europe, Deutsche Bahn is able to get a government subsidy to fix its track, its infrastructure. If you look at the US, the Navy supports those so-called privately owned ports with the dredging services. We get no subsidies or incentive or support as Transnet. That we need to find ourselves. Now, I'm not crying foul. I think that the South African government is lucky to be able to have Transnet, which has both the ports, and that's why you bring it together, because that's old economics. I find that people are also walking away from old economics, and I don't understand why. Cross subsidies are essential, especially where you have different affordabilities for different companies. The ownership of a spread of asset types is the one way in which you ensure that you have counter-cyclical cash flows that come into the business so that you are able to do those major investments. Now, it's a question I always ask is that when you go into the continent, who is that anchor for those countries? If you've ever had to deal with the private monopolist, you will know that you'll take public monopoly every time. So my last point I want to, because a public monopoly, you at least are able to discipline by virtue of the fact that the government owns that entity. Now, I think we should all remember, and I think recently somebody was, we were listening to Dr. Nkosazana Zuma, and she was reminding us actually that the South African economy is by design a mixed economy. And I think it's actually important for both the private and the public to remember that. Is that as much as the state has a right to own an entity, it is, however, essential that a state-owned entity does not in any way compete in an unfair fashion with the private sector. That I'm clear is an important principle. I then want to go to a point that Jack raises, because I want to support him, because it's actually quite crucial. This issue of technical capacity, but I want to go to technical capacity in as far as regulation is concerned. Is that we need to consolidate all of our technical capacity, techno-economic capacity, so that actually, like much of Europe, where people increasingly set up a single regulator, which is an economic regulator that regulates all networks, because their economics are fundamentally the same, you then consolidate the capacity, because it's one thing to say that you're going to have triple Ps. It's another thing to have capacity in government to manage those triple Ps, because the private sector has two habits which are known: cherry picking They'll only take the high profit businesses, and they will not go and serve the underserved community who cannot pay the full cost of that service. Number one is quite a big issue. And secondly, you're always going to find yourself in a situation when it comes to having to make a big infrastructure investment, they walk away, they're able to sell out. Because what we've all got to worry about is who is constantly making the investment in infrastructure so that you are able to support the growth of the economy. So for me, as you know, I do think it's important that we crowd in private sector money into the system for sure. There are many opportunities for private sector to come in and fund all parts of the service. And I want to go to commend, I mean, the project that Ipeleng is working on is a fantastic project to my mind, because it does the other thing which we struggle with. We stay at lip service in saying we want to do cross-border, inter-regional projects, and yet we struggle to sort of like move on. So for the first time, we should be seeing manganese mined in South Africa being exported through Namibia via the project that Ipeleng is working on. And that's essential if we are going to be able to see growth in intra-regionalism, because you can't have intra-regional agreement if you're moving no cargo between the two countries. I think I'll end there.
Yeah. But thanks very much, absolutely, for those contributions. Without doubt, I remember listening at one conference to one senior South African government official. I can't remember his name, but he was talking about the fact that we keep asking, when is that day going to come where we've got Zambian copper transported through Zimbabwe, headed the iron ore from South Africa, not being taken to China, but being given value here on African shores. Before I bring in our two funders, I wanted to take in some comments. We've got Ghislaine. It's actually a question. Ghislaine Reeb. Question is, we are in a world of transition. What are you doing regarding how transport should adjust to less carbonated model and less global movements, in brackets, shorter circuits? Thank you. I think that's a question that, is it Ipeleng or is it Malebo who wanted to talk about these issues around the carbon economy and how an efficient carbon economy can be making a difference in our new world, before we ask the minister perhaps to contribute an answer as well. Malebo, was that you? Was it Ipeleng?
Yes. I can come in, Godfrey.
It's Ipeleng, right? Yeah. Come in. That connection is still struggling a little bit, isn't it? Ipeleng, can you hear me? No, we're still struggling with her connection. Minister, do you want to respond to that question? I'm not too sure, Minister, if you heard the question that came through from a listener.
No.
All our connections struggling now. It does seem so. Minister, can you hear me?
Godfrey, can you hear me?
Godfrey, can you get me?
Yes, I can hear you, Portia. I can't hear the minister. I can't hear Ipeleng. Yeah, I can hear you, Portia. Come in.
I thought that Ipeleng was coming on side as well.
We had bits of it and then we struggled. Let's try again. Yes. Come in, Ipeleng.
Okay, thank you. We are CNG. So what we began with the end where we're trading SMN, coming up with that conversion, and how do we yes, the low carbon economy within the transport sector is quite critical. And what keeps me can is to understand how much diesel are they still burning, and probably going forward, might have some new locals that are also very friendly. So I think it's something that, again, as private sector, we will be looking into. Began the process.
Right. Great. Minister, can you hear me? It doesn't look like the minister can hear us, or the connection is definitely not stable enough. Okay, let's see if we can get him into the conversation. Anyone else out to come in on this conversation around the low carbon economy?
Godfrey, can I just add to Ipeleng's contribution as well? In the
Yes.
public transport system space, we've also been progressive with some of the first BRT rollouts that had to implement with buses that are carbon friendly, mainly CNG, but of late as well, I'm aware of 3 metros that through the DBSA are starting to procure electric buses as well. So the sector is also progressing and transitioning well into other forms of models that are also carbon friendly. Thank you.
Thank you. Jack, you wanted to come in?
Godfrey, if I can say, the world is moving towards lower carbon, less movement. The whole idea of mobility as a service is something that is getting a lot of attention overseas. This has started with the e-hailing services, where you actually just buy in mobility. You don't buy a vehicle. You just buy it when you need it. The development of autonomous vehicles, self-driving vehicles, electric vehicles, the banning of diesel. 2023, all diesel-powered vehicles will be banned out of cities in Europe. But I think what we haven't spoken about today is the impact of COVID-19 on individual choices in terms of transport, because the benefit of public transport is that you can load people in the trains and the buses. If you start talking about social distancing, we on the train, we have a loading capacity of 3 people per square meter. Metro rail goes up to 6 people per square meter. If you say people must be 1.5 meters apart, it means that you could load metro rail trains at 15% of their capacity, 1.5. Train we can load up to 50%, and buses 50%. So you all of a sudden the advantages of public transport has fallen away. So if after COVID, the individuals, firstly, their first thought would be, is it safe? Can I be infected if I go on public transport? So the first choice is that what is the most the safest opportunity. We find in overseas, they are converting streets into open spaces where people now can use bicycles and walking, because then you can keep the social distance. The unemployment numbers, we're talking about moving up unemployment up to 50%. If that's the case, we will have a 30% increase in capacity on the freeways. So people that have been forced to go to public transport because of the congestion will now get 30% better capacity on the freeways, and they're going to go back to their cars. The whole impact of work from home, we've been forced to work from home. If the COVID-19 ends, what would the choices be? If 30 or 40% of the people decide, man, it's better to work from home, again, you're going to save this capacity. So people will make either a choice to other modes of transport, non-motorized transport, or to private transport. And that becomes, so if I then have to develop infrastructure projects in future, what would the market want? So we may have to go back to the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Plan to say we need to add more capacity. So all of this has changed the whole dynamic around public transport.
It definitely has, without question. Thanks very much for that contribution, Jack. Let's see if we can able to hear the Minister again this time around. Minister, are you able to hear me?
Yes, thank you. I can now come back. Very briefly on the carbon issue that you asked about. I think that is when we got cut off at that time. The president signed the Carbon Tax Act, which came into effect in 2019 June. This ensures a polluter pay principle, and there is also a new model of electricity cars. And I had an opportunity to test drive one of those. Our strategy of moving from a road to rail strategy and the major corridors like the N3 is very critical in terms of what we seek to do going into the future. The SIPs along major corridors ensures that there is less carbon emitted along corridors, and strategic integrated projects are important to basically speak to what we need to do so that we are not caught by surprise, and this is imposed like it happened with e-hailing in South Africa, and now we are in the process of regularizing or regulating the e-hailing mode of transport in the Republic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. I wanted to bring in our funders. Before I do so, I've got a couple of questions that I wanted to put across. So question one is to Ms. Matolong. Can she please unpack a little bit more on the three areas around capacity of the states and its institutions in particular, how we should start addressing the three areas: transport governance, technical and planning capacity?
Thank you for the question. I didn't see who it's from.
It's from Matsiet.
Thank you so much. So the three areas that I spoke to in terms of competency that's needed to implement a public transport system. The first one being transport governance capacity. This really talks to a need for planning authorities that are legally and politically empowered and that are in a position to coordinate transport infrastructure and policy across modes and cities within a metropolitan area. In my opinion, this requires institutions to be empowered with the political and legal authority to achieve such a goal. And you would literally see that it exists when you have a presence of planning authorities. And in my opinion, this is not really an issue per se for a South African environment in particular. From a planning capacity point of view, Godfrey, here you need authorities that are responsible for planning needs, where they are well established, they have budget constrained mobility planning processes that effectively guide long-term public transport infrastructure development. This requires these institutions to have a proper organization, proper tools, proper processes in place to achieve these goals. And one of the indicators of this being present is a well-planned long-range capacity constraint mobility plans. And I think this is where we are lacking a little bit as a sector. And then lastly, the technical capacity I was speaking to, it's really when you have a country that needs to be able to plan and implement high quality, well-designed public transport infrastructure without major project delays. Within the environment that I'm working in, projects are behind, And it's not necessarily a human capital issue, but it's also an issue of that we don't record project qualities on time. We don't have budget project delivery processes as well. So the two last areas is where I am of opinion that we can do much better as a country, especially if we want to attract private sector investment into our space.
Absolutely. Let's go to our founders. Tom, you want to come in?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, obviously, I think I want to make a point on cost competitiveness, because, and also in the context of South Africa, coming back to, I think, a critical point I made before, which hasn't really been mentioned by anybody else. The fact is that you need cost competitiveness and also the relative among private sector companies. And of course, looking at South Africa, the problem, you can say, one of the issues South Africa has is that it's too small, frankly. Scale is non-existent. That's one of the issues. That's why regional integration is very, very important. And that's why we also have to look into new technologies, because each time you implement a new technology, it becomes more energy efficiency. Otherwise, you shouldn't implement it, of course. and then it becomes usually more cost competitive. The problem is, if you don't do that, you fall behind, and that's something I think South Africa can also not afford. Nobody else can afford it. So I think it's very important that one jumps on the track, and I think it's also happening in South Africa. But jumping on the track where one, I mean, I say that also as the EU's climate bank now. This is a new thing, but it's not easy. I agree. But then we need to look into innovative transport solutions, and we need to look into lower emissions, also because, of course, Europe is certainly the largest trading partner still with South Africa. We are looking into this. We want to be climate neutral by 2050. It won't be easy, I'm not saying, but somebody has to do this. So everybody will either be forced into this in terms of trading relationship, and you also know that FDI is around 75% from the EU to South Africa. So yes, I mean, that's where we are. We are interconnected. So we need to help each other, and we are also very interested in that. It won't be easy. So we talk about a just transition also, where hopefully I can envisage grants and so on so incentives to slowly transition the more, let's say, competitive parts of the South African economy into this more future-oriented, low-carbon economy.
Yeah, absolutely. A very important point you raised. We need to be making the preparations now rather than get hit when the time comes and then we find we can't take those products there. Monale?
Thanks very much, Godfrey. I think, the point that Malebo was making, it introduces an aspect where, in my earlier remarks, I was introducing how the MDBs function in the way that they can help in bringing in a lot of technical expertise and also bringing in oversight on project. I think this is perhaps an area where, in South Africa, there isn't, or government has not really leveraged much on what already exists. And if you think of just the framing, that, South African government is a shareholder at the World Bank, the shareholder at the AFDB, is a shareholder at the NDB, is a shareholder, broadly with the IMF. So that already tells you that some of the basic foundation has already been laid. So what is left is to understand that you need a strategy that is geared around leverage. So you put in R1 in this institution as an investment with the idea that it must come back in multiples. And more so in an environment where your struggles are really very much about capacity. These are the types of institutions that are going to come through and bring capacity and take it to the ground. So the role of government will also therefore having to de-risk project. If the NDB is to go and pursue a project somewhere in Matatiele or in Ipeleng and so forth and so forth, it's likely to be working with a municipality that has got, yes, infrastructure to deploy, but doesn't have the balance sheet to carry, to carry whatever there will be that could be a debt burden on its own balance sheet. So the state must be able to jealously facilitate that there is a relationship thereof. So it requires that strategic thinking that one leg has already been done. You're putting capital in this institution. The next leg is to ensure that you enable or you facilitate that there can be an easy transition through which then these institutions are able to access the infrastructure that is on the ground. The other part that I wanted to make, which is also along the lines of de-risking. I know Jack has been working for a while now on the Gauteng extension. I think there is an acceptance that the project itself is quite viable. It's quite viable, but if you're not able to capture the multipliers, you're forever going to be stuck on what the initial cost outlays are going to be. So the multiplier of the development along the infrastructure is not properly captured, such that when Jack says, I need a seed capital that has to be taken by the state, such that I can de-risk the project enough and make sure that the return hurdle is not too high for funders to come in. So that sort of breaking down of projects to make them viable for lenders, I think that's what we are currently looking. And I sympathize with him because I know very well that he's been working on this for a while. And maybe it brings in also the cherry picking emphasis that Portia is introducing, that the private sector would want to cherry pick. Yes, the government should also be able to think along the lines of cherry picking. In this environment of COVID and the type of economy that you're going to end up with, it means that then you cannot rely too much on direct allocations from the fiscus. And also even the traditional funding institutions are going to find themselves really quite hard pressed with regards to capital. So it means whatever is available, you must then be able to go zoom in and find that which you think that is going to be of the highest value with regards to the multiplier, and then and support them. Support them. What is the process of supporting them? I mean, I've spent a number of years in government, and I will tell you that there are a lot of plans and strategies that are coming through. Let's call it the vertical system in government works. It is clear at the top what is the instruction, be it coming from the National Development Plan, and it cascades all the way down to implementation systems. Then there's very poor vertical integration across departments that have to either ultimately have to find some sort of a compromise that a project has to work in some way or the other. So the instruction is clear, but the implementation and the integration lacks, which in essence then means that many projects are stuck in the system for one reason or the other. I mean, I'm very well aware that Transnet, as an example, would like to do an LNG terminal in Richards Bay, but there are politics within the government systems that are holding it back. So that vertical integration, I think, also needs to be improved within the intergovernmental system to enable project impact not to be stuck. I mean, you can name a number of projects across different sectors. You can go either to the telecom sector, you can go to road, you can go to everywhere. There are projects that are stuck because the government is not able to reconcile. And this is where maybe I end, because I think the reason why we are very optimistic about the SIDSSA project is that it's the first time government seems to have a clearing place where projects will be put into a pot, and perhaps as they get cooked and overcooked, many of which would have been traditional impediments to project moving are going to be resolved. I think that's where we at the NDB have been taking the cue on the SIDSSA program.
Sure. I can see the minister is listening very intently. Thanks very much, Monale, for that. So I wanted to tell you guys that we've got about 12 minutes of the program left, and I've got like 3-4 questions that need to be answered. So what I'm trying to say is that let's be tight as we can to try to answer the remaining questions. And I've got a question here from Andile Machane. He says, what provision for QSEs, in brackets, qualified small enterprises, to participate in economic revitalization has been made? I guess this is the question for the minister, right? Do you want me to ask the question again, Minister?
Yes, please.
Okay, so it's Andile, and he is asking, what provision has there been for QSEs? He called them, these are qualifying small enterprises, to participate in the economic revitalization that we are talking about. What provision has been made for these QSEs? Very fancy name for small enterprises.
Yeah, though I realize, I think I may not give an outright answer to that, except that there is a ministry created for that. But I suppose talking about infrastructure, we also need to cater for small, medium enterprises in the value chain to also take part. and be empowered. And that's what needs to happen.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Minister. Let's go to Portia. Here's a question for you, Portia. This is from Matthias, and the question is, we all know that Transnet is one of the most important SOEs that we can use as a gateway into the continental infrastructure projects. Is Transnet looking at the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and what are the opportunities have you identified both to advance Transnet as a company and for South Africa? Complex question, Portia.
Brilliant timing, because it was an issue that I did want to raise. If you look at the stats, inter-regional trade in Africa is 17%, and if you look at Asia, it's 59%. So it's a huge difference between the two. And then when you break it down further, the top 5 contributors to inter-regional trade on the continent, it's South Africa 25%, Namibia 6%, Nigeria 5%, Zambia also at the same 5%, and Cote d'Ivoire at 4%. Now, it tells you that we have to do something about improving any bit of manufacturing, no matter how basic. And not only manufacturing, and we forget that to a large extent, a large chunk of our trade, actually, even as South Africa with Europe, is fresh fruit, vegetables. So it's not even necessarily that we have to value add. It can just be high quality product. Now, we know for a fact that one of the best agricultural producers on the continent is Kenya, and Kenya for many years was able to get into the EU. So what I think we haven't been doing enough of is actually starting to understand what commodities we could trade and move between ourselves, so that you could see the growth in interregional trade, because it's not going to happen by virtue of the fact that we say it must happen. You can make the roads and things like that and the railway lines, but if there isn't production to move down, we're going to have a problem. So it's quite interesting for me that one of the things that we don't talk enough about is the rest of the trade rules that affect what moves where. So phytosanitary requirements, for example, that would impact on agricultural produce moving from one side, from one country to the other. That all needs to be pulled into the basket if we are serious about driving interregional trade. Another area which we don't talk enough about is standards across the continent. How do we ensure that we all systematically start to increase our levels of standards so that we are able to actually crowd out all of the product that we buy from Asia and that we buy from Europe? So the possibility is actually quite real to do actually competitive import replacement without the old style, close off your economy. But it's well within our capabilities to be able to function and trade holistically. I want to go to a point that the minister was raising just around supporting small, medium enterprises. We have to think hard about how we make the lower cost infrastructure like rail available to small traders. How do we ensure that what we normally demand of large customers, long-term contracts, could we do shorter-term contracts with some of these commodity owners who are sometimes seasonal traders as opposed to annual perennial traders? So I think the opportunity is massive. It requires us to start really thinking, and we've got to sort of stop this cookie cutter thing that we will take what works in Europe and assume that it will work here on the continent. It sometimes doesn't work. The opportunity is massive to actually make sure that we actually are genuinely inclusive and not continue our exclusiveness, which is going towards supporting only those which are large and well established.
100%. In standardization, I know.
Yeah. I think really the continent is important.
It is 100%. I remember the issue of standardization is one that has certainly been one of the sticking points in the negotiations around the operations of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Very quickly, it's another question here from Yolisa Kani. The question is, those are valid points. So he's talking about what Jack was saying, but he says this is about the captive market for public transport where there's no choice. He says it would be interesting to know to what extent should we be investing in public transportation infrastructure versus a working operating model that integrates what we already know exists and make it work, i.e. minibus taxi subsidy, pedestrian walkways, etc., etc. Jack, or is that the minister?
Well, can I first give a stab at it? Unfortunately, transport is a combination of all the modes. You can't cut out one mode and say move it to the rest. At the moment, Metro Rail used to transport 700 million passenger trips per year. They're down to 265 million passenger trips a year, but this is a massive amount still to be accommodated, so you can't move them on. I fully agree that we have to formalize the taxi industry, we have to bring them into the subsidy market, but you have to have both. You can't say, no, let's cut out one mode for the benefit of another mode.
Sure. I've got how many minutes? We have 5 minutes. I need to get in your closing thoughts, guys. So if I can very quickly go through all of us to give us each other a minute to sum up our thoughts in terms of perhaps the strong areas of interest, the key takeaways for all of us. I'll start with Ipeleng because we didn't quite finish your last thought. We got sabotaged by the equipment. Ipeleng?
Thank you, Godfrey. I think my closing remarks really are that if we are not going to do it, China is already on it. If you look at what China is doing, where they are investing heavily in most of our strategic ports on the continent, it tells you that if we are going to take time and continue to overly be workshopped and over-seminared and talking without action, China is already running. We will then end up being feeder ports, where China ends up actually owning the strategic ports, and then we become feeder ports. And then if you look at what they're doing in Djibouti, I work in Djibouti, you look at what they're doing between Djibouti and Ethiopia, where they built a railway line between Ethiopia and Djibouti and Eritrea, that they're beginning to actually at least condone or rather support that single market to be able to unlock the economy. So if we're not going to do it, China is already on it. So we don't have time on our side. I think it's important that we move with speed and as I said, agility. So let's also ensure that we embrace collaboration, as our leaders has alluded to, and let's not become a stumbling block, because sometimes we ourselves, particularly in South Africa, we can become stumbling blocks because we have great plans and agenda, but you'll find that ourselves, we actually can complicate things. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ipeleng. Monale, let's give the minister some minutes to think about, to take with him.
Thanks, Godfrey. I think from us, it's very straightforward. The minister, for what the NDB stands for, the government is a shareholder, and we are very ready, and we've got capital to support the different programs. If it's the high-speed train that the government would like to explore, we're happy to be a partner. If it's roads that the government needs support on, we are happy to be a partner. And I mean, for the other panelists as well, just across the board. Jack, we have spoken to you on how train, and with Transnet as well. We are in discussions on various projects. So the NDB has got capital that is ready for deployment. I think all we need is projects that have been readied for implementation.
I think that's the music to any policymakers here and any politician as well. Money is there. What are you waiting for? Tom, are you still with us?
Oh yeah, good. Thanks. Look, coming to Ipeleng's comments before, I think it's a very good point. Sorry. Yeah. The fact is that I would also rather compete or complement what we do in Europe than what they do in China if I was South Africa. And I'm a private sector specialist, actually, not a transport specialist. I think it makes more sense. So that would be the way to go, I think. And then I also would say that what we need generally to, without going into detail, I don't have time for that, but I want to make the point that one way to make more financing available is to improve the allocation of the existing finance, the existing available public and private sector funding in South Africa, to allocate it better. That will free up allocation, to help and fund the good projects. And then also, that would also help, in fact, to attract more funding from the private sector in particular. So that's again coming back to the business environment, ease of doing business and so on. But South Africa could do a lot better, in my mind. And when that happens, lots of investment will be coming in. And I know European companies, for example, are standing there waiting also. And many are engaged very much, as you know, the biggest, after all, group of FDI, biggest source of FDI in South Africa. We, as the EU bank, we stand very much ready to support the greening of the economy in particular. So innovative solutions in terms of transport, for example, but certainly in energy, where we've done CSPs and we are active in all sectors, right? We've been active since 1994. Of course, we've done around 3 billion euros already. So we actually were part of the, I should mention, the ISA toll roads as well back then, by the way. That looked as a good project at the time. And it still is. It's more the way it's managed, right? So, yeah, so we are there as a part of South Africa, looking into all the projects and where we can fit in along priorities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Minister Capital is knocking at your door. Malebo?
Thank you, Godfrey. Mine is a small consideration for the minister. For me, the main overarching issue that will slow down prudent public transport project pipelining and subsequently securing private sector funding is the merit of institutional structures that need to be coordinated and the complex relationships between the three spheres of government that needs to be managed to ensure execution and that the policy is implemented correctly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malebo. Let's go to Portia.
So I thought maybe we should end with the challenge to all of us Africans, because maybe we should do one project in the next 5 to 10 years. And I reckon the North-South corridor is long overdue. And all it requires is for us to consolidate our cargoes, because that generates demand and that generates the revenue. And then we find a way to see how we, the utilities, which are part of the countries which make up the North-South corridor, put together balance sheets and we build it ourselves. Because I think Ipeleng is quite right. If we don't do it, the Chinese will do it, and we have seen enough about what's the loss of sovereignty when that happens. So I really think it's about time that we did something.
All done and said without invoking the name of Cecil John Rhodes. Jack?
I'd like to make 3 points. First one, around planning capacity. Please, there has to be coordination between transport planning, land use planning, and economic planning. So those 3 things are done. The second point is that the point that Tom made, please don't forget it. He says Europe wants to be carbon neutral. Europe is looking for investing money in projects that are green. So rail, we're going to go and visit him because rail is the greenest way to go for transport. The third thing is that I love it that everybody says there's money. We will, Co-Train will come and visit you on Friday and we will take an empty bag. Thank you.
Says the man from the Co-Train. Thank you, Jack. Minister, your final comments, your closing thoughts.
Thank you, and all the panelists. I think the summary and conclusion issues that I think one need to take with from this discussion is road maintenance project and the program which is currently stalled because of what I've already alluded to when it comes to our road agency. But we've got massive projects that need to be implemented. Regional integration strategy, I agree. We're talking now about North-South corridor. Do one thing big and do it successfully and conclude. I agree with Portia with regard to that. We already have got a mandate and Transnet and PRASA working together. They are our delivery agencies to ensure that that comes to fruition and realization. We need to ensure low carbon carbon economy, and that has been raised sharply in our discussion. We in the Department of Transport we are already dealing with that from a policy framework to ensure that we are ahead of times, to ensure that transport respond adequately to that. We need the draft private participation framework, which now from this participation, it's clear that there is a lot of money, and the commitment I got from Ratsoma support when we announce our plans around the speed train and the feasibility study. I think you will be part of that, and ensure policy and regulatory certainty is very important to ensure that we unlock the most of the projects that are in the pipeline. And then we need to ensure that beneficiaries at the end, such as SMMEs, women and youth, do benefit. And I think I follow the line from Portia also with regard to this in terms of infrastructure. It is important that we also need to integrate small, medium enterprises. Thank you very much, Chair, and those will be my summary conclusion comments which arise from the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you to all our panelists. Thank you for your thoughts and all those people who came through with questions. And of course, there are other people who are in the background who facilitated this discussion around sustainable infrastructure development. Thank you for your contributions and your participation. I go with the last words that I got from the president here. And he says, we are reconfiguring the public sector infrastructure ecosystem to allow for a seamless consideration and packaging of projects. Now, for once, if you have one pipeline, one way of doing things, perhaps the progress that we've been struggling with may well be coming on the way. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, and good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Godfrey.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Bye.
Bye.